The doorbell camera captured it all. November 14th, 2024, 6:43 in the morning, and three black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of a pristine colonial home in Westchester County, New York. The man who answered the door wore a bathrobe and held a coffee mug. He was 71 years old, a retired financial advisor, a grandfather of five, a volunteer at the local food bank. His neighbors would later tell reporters they couldn't believe it. He was the kind of man who shoveled driveways for elderly residents, who organized the annual 4th of July block party, who always waved. The FBI agents didn't wave back. They had a warrant. They had evidence. And they had waited 23 years to knock on that door. The man's name was Robert Chen, and he was being arrested for the murders of David and Margaret Holloway, a millionaire couple who vanished during a hiking trip in October 2001 and were never seen again. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. The arrest sent shockwaves through two communities separated by hundreds of miles, but connected by a mystery that had never died. In Asheville, North Carolina, where the Holloways had lived and where they disappeared, the news landed like a thunderclap after years of eerie silence. Finally, after more than 2 decades, someone would answer for what happened on that mountain trail. Finally, the families would know. But the questions that had haunted investigators since the fall of 2001 were about to be answered in ways no one expected, revealing a betrayal so intimate and a motive so cold that it would redefine everything people thought they knew about the case. David Holloway was 52 years old in the autumn of 2001, a self-made man who had built a commercial real estate empire from nothing. He grew up in a small town in Tennessee, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher, and he never forgot where he came from. People who knew David described him as generous to a fault, the kind of man who tipped waitresses 50% and funded college scholarships for kids in his old neighborhood. He had a booming laugh that filled rooms and a handshake that made you feel like the most important person in the world. Margaret, his wife of 28 years, was 50 years old, elegant and sharp-witted, a former attorney who had retired early to focus on philanthropy. She ran a foundation that built libraries in underserved communities. She loved classical music, gardening, and long hikes in the mountains. Friends said they were inseparable. That kind of couple who still held hands in public, who finished each other's sentences, who seemed to have figured out the secret to a happy marriage. They lived in a sprawling home on the outskirts of Asheville, surrounded by trees and mountain views. Their 2 adult children, both living out of state, described their parents as adventurous, always planning the next trip, the next experience. David and Margaret had hiked across Europe, camped in Patagonia, kayaked in Alaska. The Blue Ridge Mountains were their backyard, and they knew the trails like old friends. That's why what happened in October 2001 made no sense. These weren't inexperienced hikers who got lost. These weren't reckless thrill seekers who took unnecessary risks. They were careful, prepared, and knowledgeable. And yet, on a clear autumn Saturday, they drove to a trailhead in Pisgah National Forest and simply vanished. October 13th, 2001. The date is seared into the memory of everyone who knew them. There was a Saturday, the kind of fall day that makes western North Carolina famous. The leaves were at peak color, brilliant reds and oranges and golds cascading down the mountainsides. The temperature was in the mid-60s, perfect hiking weather. David and Margaret had told friends they were planning a day hike on the Ardlope Trail, a moderately difficult route they had done before. They packed sandwiches, water, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass. Margaret left a note on the kitchen counter for their housekeeper, saying they'd be back by dinner. David filled the gas tank on their silver Mercedes SUV. They stopped at a coffee shop in town around 8 in the morning, and the barista remembered them because Margaret complimented her earrings and David left a $20 bill in the tip jar. They were in good spirits, laughing about something, looking forward to the day ahead. Their car was found the next morning. A park ranger doing his usual rounds noticed the Mercedes still sitting in the trailhead parking lot at dawn on Sunday. That wasn't unusual by itself. Sometimes hikers camped overnight, though the Holloways hadn't mentioned any camping plans. The ranger made a note and continued his patrol. By Sunday afternoon, when the vehicle was still there, he called it in. When the Holloway's son, Michael, couldn't reach his parents by phone that evening and learned their car had been at the trailhead for over 24 hours, he called the police. By Monday morning, a full-scale search and rescue operation was underway. What they found at the car troubled investigators immediately. The doors were unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. 2 backpacks sat in the rear cargo area, still packed with water bottles, energy bars, and rain jackets. A camera was on the passenger seat. Margaret's purse was tucked under the driver's seat, her wallet inside with cash and credit cards untouched. David's phone was in the cup holder, powered off. It was as if they had parked, gotten out of the car, and walked away without taking anything. No preparation, no planning, no logic to it. Search and rescue teams scoured the Art Loeb Trail and the surrounding wilderness. Volunteers from the community showed up in droves, forming lines and walking through the forest calling their names. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the mountains. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their handlers working them through the dense undergrowth. Days turned into weeks. They found nothing. The detective assigned to lead the investigation was a man named Thomas Rivera, a 20-year veteran of the Asheville Police Department with a reputation for being dogged and detail-oriented. Rivera knew these mountains. He had worked missing persons cases before, and he knew that Pisgah National Forest could be unforgiving. People got lost, fell from cliffs, succumbed to exposure. But those cases almost always ended with a body, with some trace, with closure. The complete absence of evidence in the Holloway case gnawed at him. He interviewed everyone who had been on the trails that weekend. A few hikers remembered seeing the Mercedes in the parking lot, but no one recalled seeing David or Margaret on the trail itself. It was hunting season, and Rivera briefly considered the possibility of a tragic accident involving a stray bullet, but there were no reports of shots fired in that area, no hunters who had been anywhere near the Art Loeb Trail that day. The theories multiplied in the absence of facts. Some people believed the Holloways had simply gotten lost and succumbed to the elements, that their bodies were out there somewhere in the vast wilderness, hidden in a ravine or covered by years of fallen leaves. Others suspected foul play, pointing to their wealth as a possible motive. David's real estate portfolio was worth millions. He had business dealings across 3 states, partnerships and contracts and financial entanglements that could have made enemies. Detectives looked into his business associates, scrutinized deals that had gone south, interviewed former employees who had been let go. They found nothing that suggested violence or revenge. David Holloway was liked, respected, even admired. No one wanted him dead. Margaret's past was equally clean. Her legal career had been focused on corporate law, mergers and acquisitions, nothing criminal or controversial. Her foundation work had touched hundreds of lives positively. The couple had no known enemies, no stalkers, no threatening letters or disturbing phone calls. Their marriage, by all accounts, was solid. There were no affairs, no secret lives, no hidden addictions. They were, to everyone who knew them, exactly who they appeared to be, good people living a good life, which made their disappearance all the more inexplicable. As weeks turned to months, a new theory emerged, one that Detective Rivera found himself considering despite how much he hated it. What if they had run? What if the perfect marriage and the perfect life were a facade, and David and Margaret had staged their own disappearance to escape something? Financial records were subpoenaed and examined line by line. Forensic accountants went through years of bank statements, investments, tax returns. They found nothing irregular, no hidden offshore accounts, no massive debts, no embezzlement schemes. The Holloways were exactly as wealthy as they appeared to be, and their money was clean. The staged disappearance theory collapsed under the weight of evidence that contradicted it. People who vanish on purpose, take their passports, drain their bank accounts, leave behind clues to throw investigators off the trail. David and Margaret had done none of those things. Their passports were in a drawer at home. Their accounts remained untouched, money sitting idle as months passed. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same terrible conclusion. Something had happened to them on that mountain, something sudden and violent, and whoever was responsible had hidden the bodies so well that an army of searchers couldn't find them. The media attention was intense at first. The story had everything cable news loved: wealth, mystery, a beautiful couple, a scenic mountain backdrop. Nancy Grace covered it. Dateline sent a crew. The Holloway children appeared on morning shows pleading for information. A reward fund was established, growing to over $200,000 for information leading to the recovery of David and Margaret or the arrest of anyone responsible for their disappearance. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, and detectives ran down every lead, no matter how far-fetched. Psychics called claiming to know where the bodies were buried. Conspiracy theorists pointed to everything from alien abduction to government cover-ups. None of it led anywhere real. By the spring of 2002, the media had moved on to other tragedies, other mysteries. The search efforts were scaled back, then suspended. The case was officially designated as a cold case, though Detective Rivera never stopped working it. He kept the file on his desk, reviewed it regularly, followed up on occasional new tips that trickled in. He attended the vigils that the Holloway children organized every year on the anniversary of their parents' disappearance, standing quietly in the back while families and friends gathered to remember and to hope. He met with Michael and Sarah Holloway regularly, updating them even when there was nothing new to report, maintaining the connection because he had promised them he would never give up. And he didn't. Even after he retired from the police department in 2015, Rivera kept his own copy of the case file, kept thinking about what he had missed, kept waiting for the break that would finally make sense of the senseless. The break, when it finally came, would originate not from the mountains of North Carolina, but from a genealogy database in California, from technology that didn't exist in 2001, from a science that would reach across 2 decades and pull the truth into the light. But in those early days of the investigation, as autumn gave way to winter and the first snow fell on Pisgah National Forest, all anyone knew was that David and Margaret Holloway had walked into the woods and never walked out, and somewhere in those ancient mountains a secret was buried that would stay hidden for 23 years. The search efforts in those first weeks were exhausting and heartbreaking. Volunteers showed up every morning at the Pisgah Ranger Station, sometimes over 100 people, signing waivers and collecting assignments before heading into the forest in organized lines. They walked shoulder to shoulder through dense laurel thickets and across steep ridges, calling out names that echoed unanswered through the trees. The leaves were falling fast that October, carpeting the forest floor in layers of red and gold that could hide anything. Searchers looked for disturbed earth, torn clothing, any sign that David and Margaret had passed through. They found hiking trash left by other visitors, old campfire rings, a rusted bicycle frame from decades past. They did not find the Holloways. The search and rescue coordinators brought in specialists. Technical rope teams rappelled down cliff faces and explored rocky overhangs where a fall victim might have landed. Swiftwater rescue teams checked the creeks and streams looking for bodies that might have washed downstream. The cadaver dogs worked tirelessly, their handlers watching for any change in behavior that might indicate the scent of human remains. The dogs alerted a few times, leading searchers to spots where deer had died or where hunters had field-dressed game years earlier. Each false alarm was another small devastation, another moment of hope extinguished. After 3 weeks of intensive searching covering over 50 square miles of wilderness, the operation was scaled back to periodic targeted searches based on new information or tips. Detective Thomas Rivera became the face of the investigation, the person the media called for updates, the one the Holloway family trusted to find answers. Rivera was 47 years old when the case landed on his desk, a compact man with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. He had grown up in Asheville, knew the mountains intimately, had hiked many of the same trails the Holloways favored. That local knowledge made the mystery even more frustrating. He knew how hard it was to simply vanish in these woods. The Ardlobe Trail was popular, well-marked, not particularly remote. Other hikers were almost always around, especially on a perfect October Saturday. The fact that no one had seen David and Margaret on the trail that day struck Rivera as significant, though he couldn't quite articulate why. He began mapping out the couple's final days and weeks, looking for patterns or anomalies. Their calendar showed a normal life. David had attended a real estate closing on Thursday, played golf on Friday morning. Margaret had a dentist appointment on Wednesday, lunch with friends on Thursday. They had dinner reservations for the following Tuesday at their favorite Italian restaurant in downtown Asheville. These were not the activities of people planning to disappear or people afraid for their lives. Rivera interviewed their friends, their business associates, their housekeeper, their accountant. Everyone told the same story. David and Margaret were happy, healthy, excited about an upcoming trip to Italy they had planned for November. There were no arguments, no unusual phone calls, no strange visitors to their home. The financial investigation became exhaustive. Rivera worked with forensic accountants who examined every transaction David had made in his real estate business over the past 5 years. Commercial real estate could be a cutthroat world, and deals worth millions sometimes created enemies. They found competitive bidding situations where David had won properties over other investors, but nothing that suggested the kind of animosity that led to murder. They looked at his partners, men who jointly owned shopping centers and office buildings with David across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The partnerships were profitable and apparently amicable. They interviewed tenants who rented commercial space in David's properties, looking for disputes over leases or evictions. They found normal business disagreements, nothing more. Margaret's foundation work opened another avenue of investigation. She had traveled frequently for the library projects, visiting rural communities, meeting with local officials and donors. Rivera wondered if she had witnessed something criminal, stumbled into something dangerous during her charity work. He traced her movements over the previous year, interviewed people she had worked with in small towns across Appalachia. Everyone remembered her fondly, described her as dedicated and kind. No one recalled anything unusual or threatening. The foundation's finances were transparent and properly managed. There was no embezzlement, no fraud, nothing that would motivate violence. The couple's adult children, Michael and Sarah, became part of Rivera's investigation in the way that family always does in missing persons cases. He had to consider every possibility, including the terrible ones. Michael was 31, living in Charlotte, working as a software engineer. Sarah was 28, a teacher in Atlanta. Both had solid alibis. For the weekend, their parents disappeared. Both were devastated and cooperative, providing access to family photos, old letters, anything that might help. Rivera searched for family conflicts, inheritance disputes, reasons the children might want their parents gone. He found only love and normalcy. The Holloways had been close, talked regularly, visited often. Michael and Sarah had both spoken to their parents by phone on Friday evening, less than 24 hours before the disappearance, and nothing in those conversations suggested anything wrong. As the first anniversary approached in October 2002, Rivera had accumulated thousands of pages of interviews, financial records, phone logs, and search reports. He had a timeline of the Holloways' last known movements down to the minute. He had a profile of their lives that was almost invasive in its detail. And he had no suspects, no motive, no crime scene, and no bodies. The case was eating at him, invading his sleep, following him home. His wife noticed the obsession, gently suggested he needed to maintain boundaries between work and life. Rivera tried, but the Holloways wouldn't let him go. He kept seeing Margaret's smile in the photos, David's confident handshake that witnesses described. They deserved answers. Their children deserved closure. The reward fund announcement brought a deluge of tips, most of them well-intentioned but useless. People reported seeing couples matching the Holloways' description in neighboring states, in Mexico, in Canada. Every sighting had to be checked, and everyone turned out to be a different couple living their own lives. A few tips were more credible. A hiker reported seeing a man fitting David's description arguing with another man near the trailhead on that Saturday morning, but when pressed for details, the witness admitted the memory was fuzzy and he couldn't be sure of the date or the location. Another witness claimed to have seen a silver Mercedes driving erratically on a Forest Service road near Pisgah on the afternoon of October 13th. But the witness was elderly and couldn't remember which road or provide any other useful details. Rivera became particularly interested in a local handyman named Leonard Pritchard who had done work on the Holloway property over the years. Pritchard had repaired their deck, done some electrical work, handled odd jobs. He was known in the area as reliable but odd, a loner who lived in a trailer on family land deeper in the mountains. When detectives interviewed him, Pritchard was nervous and evasive, giving inconsistent answers about his whereabouts on October 13th. Rivera obtained a search warrant for Pritchard's property and trailer. They found a cluttered mess of tools, spare parts, and general disorder, but no evidence connecting him to the Holloways' disappearance. Pritchard eventually admitted he had lied about his alibi because he had been poaching deer on state land that weekend and didn't want to get in trouble. Game wardens confirmed finding illegal deer stands in the area where Pritchard said he had been hunting, miles from the Art Loeb Trail. The lead evaporated. Another person of interest emerged from David's business world. Kenneth Marsh was a commercial real estate investor based in Charlotte who had been in direct competition with David on several major deals over the years. Marsh had lost a particularly lucrative property acquisition to David in early 2001, a shopping center deal worth over $3 million. Associates described Marsh as bitter about the loss, and there were rumors of heated arguments between the two men. Rivera drove to Charlotte and interviewed Marsh, a slick man in an expensive suit who made no secret of his dislike for David Holloway. But dislike wasn't evidence of murder. Marsh had an alibi for the weekend of October 13th. He had been in Florida at a real estate conference, surrounded by witnesses, far from the mountains of North Carolina. His credit card records and hotel receipts confirmed it. Rivera left the interview frustrated but unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something, that the answer was hiding in plain sight somewhere in the mass of information he had collected. The years began to pass with cruel speed. Each October, the anniversary vigil grew a little smaller as people moved on with their lives, as the immediate shock and grief gave way to resigned sadness. Michael and Sarah Holloway aged visibly, the stress of not knowing carving lines into their faces. They both married, had children of their own, tried to build lives while carrying the weight of their parents' unsolved disappearance. They called Rivera regularly, and he always took their calls, always gave them time, even when he had nothing new to report. He attended Michael's wedding in 2004, Sarah's in 2006, sat quietly in the back and thought about how David and Margaret should have been there, how they should have walked their daughter down the aisle, danced at the reception, held their grandchildren. Rivera retired from the Asheville Police Department in 2015, but he couldn't retire from the Holloway case. He kept his personal copy of the file in a box in his home office, took it out regularly, reviewed the evidence looking for what he had missed. He had theories, dozens of them, but theories without evidence were just stories. He believed David and Margaret had encountered someone on that trail, someone who killed them quickly and hid the bodies with knowledge of the terrain. He believed it was someone local, someone who knew those mountains well enough to make two people vanish without a trace, but knowing that in his gut and proving it in court were different universes apart. The Holloway children kept the case alive in other ways. Sarah created a website dedicated to her parents' memory, posting photos and details about the case, hoping someone browsing the internet might recognize something or remember a detail they had forgotten. Michael used his technology skills to create a digital timeline of the investigation, organizing all the public information in a searchable database. Both of them spoke to true crime podcasters and bloggers who occasionally revisited the case, keeping the story in circulation, keeping the reward offer visible. They never gave up hope that someone knew something, that someday a conscience would break or a deathbed confession would emerge. In the community, the Holloway disappearance became a kind of local legend, the kind of story people told newcomers about the darker side of the beautiful mountains. The house David and Margaret had lived in sold in 2003. The new owners unaware of the tragedy until neighbors told them. The Art Loeb Trail remained popular with hikers, though some avoided it out of superstition, feeling that the woods there held something dark. Occasionally, hikers reported finding items in the forest and called police wondering if they might be connected to the Holloways. Every report was investigated. A weathered backpack found in 2008 turned out to be from the 1980s based on its style. A fragment of clothing discovered in 2012 was traced to a different missing person case from a different decade. The mountains kept their secrets. Detective Rivera, now in his late 60s and fully retired, sometimes drove out to the Pisgah trailhead where the Mercedes had been found all those years ago. He would park in the same lot, sit in his car, and try to imagine what David and Margaret had been thinking that morning, where they had gone, what had happened. The forest had changed in small ways over the decades. Trees had fallen and new growth had filled in. The parking lot had been repaved. A new trail marker had been installed. But the essential mystery remained unchanged, a cold case that had consumed years of his life and the lives of everyone who had loved the Holloways. What Rivera didn't know in those years of frustration and dead ends was that the answer had been in his files all along, buried in a list of people interviewed early in the investigation, a name that had been cleared and dismissed as irrelevant. The technology that would eventually crack the case didn't exist when David and Margaret disappeared. The science of forensic genealogy was still in its infancy. The databases that would eventually hold millions of DNA profiles were just being created. The breakthrough, when it finally came in 2024, would reach back through more than 2 decades and connect dots that Rivera had never thought to connect, revealing a truth so close to the victims that it made the betrayal almost unbearable to contemplate. The breakthrough began not with a dramatic discovery, but with a routine review. In early 2023, a new cold case unit was established within the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, funded by a state grant specifically targeting unsolved cases from before 2005. The unit was small, just 4 investigators and 2 forensic specialists, but they had something their predecessors lacked: access to technology that had revolutionized criminal investigation in the 21st century. Forensic genealogy had solved the Golden State Killer case in California, had identified murder victims who had been nameless for decades, had brought closure to families who thought they would never get answers. The Holloway case was selected as one of the first to be re-examined using these new tools. The lead investigator assigned to the review was a woman named Agent Lauren Vasquez, 39 years old, a former FBI analyst who had joined the State Bureau specifically to work cold cases. Vasquez had no personal connection to the Holloway disappearance, which was actually an advantage. She could look at the evidence without the emotional weight that had burdened the original investigators. She started by digitizing everything, scanning thousands of pages of reports and witness statements into a searchable database. Then she began reading, absorbing the details of a case that had gone cold before she had even started her law enforcement career. What caught Vasquez's attention was something almost overlooked in the original investigation: a trace evidence report from the Holloway vehicle. When the Mercedes had been processed in 2001, forensic technicians had vacuumed the interior and collected fiber samples, hair samples, fingerprints, anything that might be relevant. Most of what they found belonged to David and Margaret themselves, which was expected. But there were also several unidentified hairs found on the driver's seat headrest, hairs that didn't match either of the Holloways. In 2001, that evidence had limited value. Hair analysis could determine color and texture, but couldn't definitively identify an individual. The hairs had been noted in the report and stored in the evidence room, where they had sat untouched for over 2 decades. Vasquez requested the physical evidence be retrieved from storage. The hairs were still there, carefully preserved in sealed envelopes, labeled and documented. In 2024, those hairs could tell a story that was impossible to hear in 2001. If the hairs still had root material attached, they could yield DNA. And if that DNA could be extracted and sequenced, it could be compared against modern databases that held genetic information from millions of people. Vasquez sent the samples to a private lab that specialized in extracting DNA from degraded or limited biological samples, the kind of lab that worked miracles with evidence everyone else had given up on. The lab worked for 3 months. The hair samples were old, the biological material limited, but the technicians were patient and skilled. In June 2023, they delivered results. They had successfully extracted DNA from 2 of the hair samples, enough to create a partial genetic profile. It wasn't a full profile, but it was sufficient for genealogical comparison. Vasquez uploaded the DNA data to GED Match, a public genealogy database used by both amateur family historians and law enforcement. The system began searching for genetic matches, looking for distant relatives who shared segments of DNA with the unknown person who had left hair in the Holloway vehicle. The results came back with several third and fourth cousin matches, people who shared a common ancestor with the unknown subject somewhere in the past century. This was where the painstaking work of forensic genealogy began. Vasquez partnered with a professional genetic genealogist, a woman named Barbara Chen, who had helped solve over 30 cold cases using family tree research. Barbara began building family trees for each of the genetic matches, working backward through generations, identifying common ancestors, then working forward through their descendants. It was like assembling a massive jigsaw puzzle, where most of the pieces were missing and the picture on the box was unclear. The work took months. Barbara traced branches of families through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and social media profiles. She identified hundreds of potential descendants of the common ancestors, then began the process of elimination. Who would have been in North Carolina in 2001? Who would have had access to the Holloways? Who matched the age range suggested by the DNA? The family trees grew more complex, sprawling across multiple states and generations. And then, in November 2023, a name emerged that made Vasquez's heart race. Robert Chen, financial advisor, lived in Westchester County, New York, but originally from Charlotte, North Carolina. More importantly, Robert Chen had been a business associate of David Holloway. Vasquez pulled the original investigation files and found Chen's name in the witness interview logs. He had been questioned briefly in November 2001 as part of the broad sweep of David's business contacts. Chen had told investigators he barely knew the Holloways, had only met David a few times at real estate conferences, had no knowledge of their disappearance. The interview had been routine, unremarkable, and Chen had been quickly eliminated from further investigation. There had been no reason to suspect him of anything. But now, 23 years later, his DNA appeared to be in the Holloway vehicle, and that changed everything. Vasquez began a deep dive into Robert Chen's background. He was 71 years old in 2024, had moved from North Carolina to New York in 2003, had built a successful career managing investments for wealthy clients. He was married, had 3 adult children, 5 grandchildren, was active in his community. On the surface, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a respectable retired professional enjoying his golden years. But Vasquez was trained to look beneath surfaces. She started with financial records, obtaining warrants to examine Chen's banking history going back to 2001. What she found was interesting. In late October 2001, just weeks after the Holloways disappeared, Chen had made a series of unusual cash withdrawals totaling nearly $40,000. The withdrawals were structured to stay just below the reporting threshold that would have triggered automatic scrutiny. In early November 2001, Chen had paid off a significant gambling debt, a fact that had never come up in the original investigation because no one had looked closely at his finances. Vasquez dug deeper and discovered that Chen had had a serious gambling problem in the late 1990s and early 2000s, racking up debts at casinos in Cherokee and across state lines in Tennessee. He owed money to people who didn't accept excuses or payment plans. The motive was beginning to crystallize, but Vasquez needed more. She traveled to Charlotte and began re-interviewing people who had known both David Holloway and Robert Chen in 2001. What emerged was a picture very different from the casual acquaintance story Chen had told police. Chen and Holloway had actually been close friends in the late 1990s. They had golfed together regularly, attended the same church, socialized at the same country club. Their wives had been friendly. The families had shared dinners. And then, sometime in 2000, the friendship had cooled abruptly. People remembered noticing it but didn't know why. One former mutual friend recalled David making a vague comment about not being able to trust everyone, about learning who your real friends were. Vasquez obtained warrants for Chen's old phone records, digitized from archived telephone company files. The records showed frequent calls between Chen and David Holloway throughout 1999 and early 2000, then a sudden stop. But there was one more call, on October 12, 2001, the day before the Holloways disappeared. Chen had called David's cell phone and they had spoken for 11 minutes. That call had never been mentioned in Chen's original police interview. When asked if he had been in contact with the Holloways around the time of their disappearance, Chen had said no. That was a lie, and lies in murder investigations mattered. The investigators built their case methodically, knowing they would only get one chance. They obtained Chen's DNA surreptitiously, collecting a coffee cup he discarded at a Starbucks, and sent it for analysis. The results came back in October 2024, a definitive match to the hair found in the Holloway vehicle. They had physical evidence placing Robert Chen inside the car David and Margaret were last seen driving. Combined with the financial motive, the suspicious timing, the lies to police, and the hidden relationship between the two men, the case was strong enough to prosecute. Agent Vasquez briefed the district attorney in North Carolina, who agreed to seek an indictment. An arrest warrant was issued, and Vasquez coordinated with the FBI field office in New York to execute it. They wanted to move quickly, before Chen had any indication he was under investigation, before he could run or destroy evidence or harm himself. The arrest was planned for early morning when subjects were typically least alert and most likely to be home, November 14, 2024. The FBI tactical team arrived at Chen's home before dawn. Agent Vasquez was there, wanting to be present when justice finally came for the Holloways after 23 years. When Chen opened the door in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, the look on his face was one of shock and confusion. He asked what this was about. The agents informed him he was under arrest for 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of David and Margaret Holloway. Chen's wife screamed. His neighbors would later tell reporters they heard the commotion, saw the SUVs, watched in disbelief as a man they thought they knew was led away in handcuffs. Chen initially refused to speak without an attorney, which was his right. But during the transport back to North Carolina, during the long hours in an interrogation room waiting for his lawyer to arrive, something in him broke. Maybe it was the weight of carrying the secret for 23 years. Maybe it was the knowledge that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Maybe it was the simple exhaustion of maintaining a lie for more than 2 decades. When his attorney finally arrived, Chen asked for a moment alone with him, and when they emerged, the attorney informed investigators that his client wished to make a statement. The confession, when it came, was devastating in its ordinariness. Robert Chen explained that he and David Holloway had indeed been close friends, and that friendship had led Chen to confide in David about his gambling debts in early 2000. David had loaned Chen $50,000 to pay off his creditors, an act of generosity that came with the expectation that the money would be repaid. Chen had promised to repay it within a year. But the gambling continued, and Chen found himself unable to pay David back. The friendship soured. David became insistent, then angry, threatening to expose Chen's gambling problem to his wife, to his employer, to ruin his reputation if the debt wasn't settled. By October 2001, Chen was desperate. The people he owed money to were no longer willing to wait. He faced professional ruin and possibly worse. He called David on October 12th and asked to meet, suggested a hike where they could talk privately away from wives and offices. David agreed, perhaps hoping to settle things, or perhaps wary enough that he wanted the conversation in a public place. They arranged to meet at the Pisgah trailhead on Saturday morning. Chen arrived early, parked in a different lot, and walked to meet them. Margaret came too, David apparently not wanting to meet Chen alone. The meeting started as a conversation but escalated quickly. Chen begged for more time. David refused, said the debt had to be paid in full, immediately. Chen claimed he had panicked, that he wasn't thinking clearly. He had brought a gun, though he later insisted he only meant to scare David, to buy more time. There was an argument on the trail, away from other hikers. Chen pulled the gun. Margaret screamed. And then, according to Chen's confession, everything happened fast. He shot David first, then Margaret when she tried to run. 2 shots, quick succession, the sound echoing through the mountains. Both of them fell on the trail, and Robert Chen stood there realizing what he had done. He dragged the bodies off the trail into dense undergrowth, working frantically, checking constantly for other hikers. He used fallen branches and leaves to cover them temporarily, knowing he would have to come back after dark to hide them more permanently. He returned to his car, drove home to Charlotte in a daze, then returned to Pisgah that night with a shovel and supplies. He spent hours in the dark forest, digging a grave in a location he had scouted, a steep ravine far from any trail where erosion and wildlife would help conceal what he had done. He buried David and Margaret Holloway deep in the North Carolina mountains, covered the gravesite with rocks and debris, and made it look like nature. Before leaving the trailhead that Saturday morning after the shooting, Chen had wiped down the Mercedes interior, trying to remove any trace of himself. He had sat in the driver's seat, adjusting things, planting the idea of confusion. But he had missed the hair on the headrest, the microscopic evidence that would sleep in an evidence locker for 23 years before technology gave it a voice. He had thought he had gotten away with it, and for more than 2 decades he had. The confession led investigators to the burial site, a remote ravine miles from the Art Loeb Trail. In December 2024, a forensic recovery team excavated the location and found remains consistent with 2 individuals. Dental records confirmed the identities, David and Margaret Holloway finally coming home after 23 years in the wilderness. The recovery was handled with dignity and respect, and Agent Vasquez made sure Michael and Sarah Holloway were notified personally before any media could report it. The trial was scheduled for spring 2025, but Chen's confession and the physical evidence made the outcome certain. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder, accepting a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. The courtroom in Asheville was packed the day of sentencing. Michael and Sarah Holloway sat in the front row, holding hands, their own children beside them. Thomas Rivera, now 70 and long retired, sat a few rows back, tears streaming down his face as the judge pronounced sentence. Agent Vasquez sat with the prosecution team, feeling the complex mix of satisfaction and sorrow that comes with solving a case where justice arrives decades too late to truly matter. Michael Holloway was allowed to make a victim impact statement. He spoke about growing up without knowing what happened to his parents, about planning his wedding without his father there to shake his hand or his mother to help choose flowers. He spoke about his own children, who would never know their grandparents, about 23 years of anniversaries and holidays shadowed by absence and uncertainty. His voice broke when he thanked the investigators who never gave up, who kept working even when the case seemed impossible. He looked directly at Robert Chen and said simply, "You took everything from us, and you can never give it back." Sarah spoke too, reading from a prepared statement because she didn't trust herself to speak extemporaneously. She described her mother's laugh, her father's terrible jokes, the way they loved each other and their family. She talked about how the not knowing had been its own kind of torture, worse in some ways than grief because it never resolved. She said that finally having answers felt like being able to breathe for the first time in 23 years, even though the answers were painful. She thanked Agent Vasquez by name, thanked the cold case unit, thanked science and persistence and the refusal of good people to let the truth stay buried. Robert Chen sat motionless through the statements, his face blank. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he stood and offered a brief apology that sounded hollow and insufficient. He said he had lived with guilt every day since 2001, that he had wanted to confess, but fear had kept him silent. The judge was unmoved. Justice, she said before pronouncing sentence, was not just about punishment but about truth, about restoring order to a world disrupted by violence. The Holloway family had waited 23 years for truth. Now they had it, and now Robert Chen would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had stolen. After the sentencing, Agent Vasquez drove out to the Pisgah trailhead one last time. She walked a short distance down the Art Loeb Trail, thinking about the case, about the power of patience and science and dedication. The mountains were beautiful in the late winter light, peaceful and indifferent to human tragedy. She thought about David and Margaret Holloway, who came here for beauty and found death instead. She thought about their children, who could finally lay their parents to rest. And she thought about the lesson the case taught, that truth has a weight to it, that secrets buried deep can still be found, and that time, while it may delay justice, cannot prevent it forever. The mountains kept secrets, but science and persistence could make them speak. Somewhere in the forest the bird called. Agent Vasquez stood quietly for a moment, then turned and walked back to her car, leaving the trail to its peace.